The sun dipped toward the horizon, bathing the lake in a warm, golden glow that shimmered across the water's surface. Jack Clink perched on the edge of a weathered wooden dock, its planks creaking faintly beneath his weight. His fishing rod rested loosely across his lap, the line trailing lazily into the calm, rippling depths below. Beside him sat his 10-year-old son, Mayo, his small legs swinging freely over the dock's edge, toes brushing the air just above the water. The boy's dark hair caught the fading light, and his wide, curious eyes flickered between the lake and his father. "Think we'll catch anything today, Dad?" Mayo's voice was soft, threaded with a quiet hope that seemed to hang in the still air. Jack turned his head, a slow, easy smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he met his son's gaze. "Maybe," he said, his tone warm and patient, "if we're willing to wait it out long enough." He reached over, ruffling Mayo's hair with a calloused hand, the gesture tender and familiar. "But you know, it's not really about the fish, right?" Mayo didn't reply with words, but the faint grin that spread across his face spoke volumes. This was their sanctuary, stolen hours by the lake, far from the clamor of the city, far from the relentless demands of Jack's life as a police officer. Out here, it was just the two of them, surrounded by the whispering woods and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. They'd been there for hours, watching the sun sink lower, its light spilling across the lake in hues of orange and deep violet. Jack stretched his stiff back, feeling the ache of a long day settle into his bones. "Ready to head home, kiddo?" he asked, his voice relaxed, almost reluctant to break the spell of the afternoon. Mayo nodded, hopping to his feet and brushing the dust from his worn jeans with quick, careless swipes. Jack reeled in his line, the soft whir of the reel blending with the distant chirping of crickets. He packed away the tackle box, savoring the quiet rhythm of their routine. But as he slung the gear over his shoulder and turned to leave, a strange heaviness settled over the scene. The air, once light and serene, grew thick, the stillness pressing in like an unseen hand. Jack's brow furrowed. He wasn't a man prone to nervous ires on the force had sharpened his senses, taught him to trust the instincts that hummed beneath his skin. Something was wrong. A faint rustling stirred the trees behind them, sharp and deliberate. Cutting through the evening's calm, his hand found Mayo's shoulder, firm yet gentle, grounding them both. "Stay close to me," he whispered, the warmth draining from his voice, replaced by a steely edge. Mayo's face tightened, his eyes darting to his father's. "What is it?" he asked, his small voice trembling with the first threads of fear. Before Jack could answer, two figures emerged from the shadowed woods, their movements swift and purposeful. Black ski masks obscured their faces, leaving only their eyes visible, cold, unyielding, and far too certain. Jack's stomach twisted, a sickening lurch that told him this wasn't random. These weren't petty thieves or drifters stumbling across their path. He knew that stride, that confidence. They were here for him. Without a second's hesitation, he shoved Mayo behind him, his body a shield between his son and the threat. "Run, Mayo," he said, his voice low but urgent, a command wrapped in desperation. "Hide." Now, his tone rose, a rare crack of panic breaking through. Mayo hesitated, his sneakers rooted to the ground for a fleeting moment, then bolted, diving into the thick brush nearby. He crouched low, his small frame trembling as he peered through the tangle of leaves, his heart hammering so loud he feared it might betray him. Jack straightened, squaring his broad shoulders, his jaw set in defiance. He wasn't armed, not here, not on this sacred ground where he'd promised Mayo a day of peace. His badge, tucked away in the glove box of his truck, was useless now. The taller of the two men stepped forward, a gun gleaming in his hand, its barrel trained on Jack's chest. "You've been poking around where you don't belong, Clink," he said, his voice a low growl, steady and deliberate. Jack's pulse raced, but his face remained a mask of calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his words measured, buying time. The second man, shorter and stockier, moved closer, raising the gun higher. "Don't play dumb," he snapped, his tone rougher, less controlled. "You've gotten too close to something that's not yours to touch." Jack's eyes flicked toward the bushes where Mayo hid, a pang of dread slicing through him. His son shouldn't see this, shouldn't have to carry the weight of what was coming. But there was no escape, no bargaining his way out. He took a slow step forward, positioning himself more firmly between the gunmen and Mayo's hiding spot. "If this is about money," he said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his insides, "I'll get it for you. But not here, not with my boy watching." The taller man shook his head, a faint, bitter edge to the gesture. "It's not about money, Jack. It's about what you know." Before Jack could respond, the shorter man's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot exploded through the air, a deafening crack that shattered the evening's peace. Jack stumbled back, his hand flying to his side as blood bloomed across his shirt. Dark and relentless, his knees gave way, and he crumpled to the ground, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Hidden in the bushes, Mayo's world stopped, his heart seized. A scream lodged in his throat as he bit down hard on his lip, the metallic taste of blood mingling with the tears welling in his eyes. "Don't make a sound," he told himself, his small hands clamped over his mouth, shaking uncontrollably. Jack struggled to push himself up, his arms trembling, his vision blurring as pain radiated through him. But he kept his gaze locked on the masked men, refusing to let them see the fear that gnawed at his core. He had to be strong for Mayo, for the boy he'd sworn to protect. The taller man knelt beside him, peeling off his mask with a slow, deliberate motion. Jack's eyes widened, a flash of recognition cutting through the haze of pain. He knew that Facenu, the betrayal etched into its lines. His lips parted, but no sound came. "You should have stayed out of it, Clink," the man murmured, his voice tinged with something like regret. Then he raised his gun again and fired twice more, point blank, execution style. Jack's body went still, the light fading from his eyes as the life drained out of him. Mayo's hands tightened over his mouth, tears streaming down his cheeks, hot and silent. He wanted to scream, to run to his father, but his body wouldn't move. The men didn't linger. They turned, their footsteps heavy against the earth, vanishing back into the trees as swiftly as they'd appeared. The woods fell silent again, an eerie, suffocating stillness that pressed against Mayo's chest. Only when he was sure they were gone did he crawl out, his knees scraping the dirt as he scrambled to his father's side. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking, barely audible. "Dad, please." He reached for Jack's hand, but it was cold, lifeless, the warmth of their day together slipping away like the last rays of sunlight. Mayo sank to the ground beside him, his small frame trembling under the crushing weight of loss. The laughter they'd shared, the quiet moments by the waterall of it torn apart in an instant. He didn't understand, couldn't grasp the full scope of what he'd seen. But something deep within him shifted, a seed of rage and resolve planting itself in the soil of his grief. Years later, Mayo jolted awake, his body drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as he stared into the darkness of his bedroom. The ceiling loomed above him, oppressive and unyielding. As the echoes of that day flooded his mind, masked men, the gunshots, his father's final, gasping breath. "Hey, hey," came a soft voice beside him. His wife, Sarah, stirred, rolling over to rest a gentle hand on his arm. Another nightmare. Mayo dragged a hand over his face, trying to steady the frantic rhythm of his pulse. The cold dread clung to him, a shadow he couldn't shake. "Yeah," he muttered, swinging his legs over the bed's edge, the floor cool against his bare feet. "Same one." Sarah shifted closer, her fingers tracing soothing circles on his back. "It's been a while since the last one," she said, her voice tender but laced with worry. "Yeah," Mayo replied, but the word felt hollow, his thoughts already spiraling back to the lake, to the blood staining the earth, to the truth he'd spent 2 decades chasing. Those men had thought they'd buried their secret with Jack's body, but Mayo was no longer that terrified boy hiding in the bushes. He was a man now, driven by a burning need for justice, determined to unearth the conspiracy that had stolen his fatherland, to make those responsible pay. The lesson was clear: power, when wielded without accountability, bred monsters. Jack had died because he dared to challenge that power, and the ripples of that abuse had shaped Mayo's life ever since. But the consequences would not end with his father's death. They would stretch further, deeper, until every hidden truth was dragged into the light, and justice, however delayed, was finally served. In the dim stillness of the bedroom, Mayo stood apart, his presence almost ghostly as he dragged a weary hand through his damp, tangled hair. The faint glow of the nightstand clock cast a pale light across his face. 3:17 a.m. The numbers glared at him, a silent accusation of sleeplessness. Behind him, Sarah stirred, her movements soft and deliberate as she propped herself up on the bed. She reached out, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders from behind, her touch warm against the chill that seemed to cling to him. "You want to talk about it?" she murmured, her voice a gentle tether pulling him back from the abyss of his thoughts. Mayo shook his head, the motion slow and heavy, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It's always the same," he said, his voice rough, frayed at the edges. "I'm there hiding, watching, powerless. I couldn't save him." His words hung in the air, thick with regret, and Sarah tightened her hold, pressing her cheek against the tense muscles of his back. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin, her tone laced with a quiet certainty she hoped he'd one day believe. But Mayo's response was hollow, a faint "I know" that lacked any real conviction. His eyes dropped to the hardwood floor, staring blankly as his mind spiraled back to that day etched into his soul. With razor-sharp clarity, there was something about it, something insidious that had festered in the shadows of his memory for years, just out of reach. It gnawed at him, a persistent ache that refused to fade. "The men who killed my father," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They weren't amateurs." He paused, letting the realization settle like dust in the stillness. They weren't just some random pack of thugs looking for a quick score. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew who they were coming for. Sarah shifted, tilting her head to peer up at him, her hazel eyes catching the faint light as she blinked in quiet surprise. "You've said that before," she replied, her voice cautious but steady. "But what's changed?" Mayo's jaw tightened, his tone growing sharper, more urgent. "Now I know it. It wasn't cows, it was calculated. Like they'd planned every step, like they'd known him." His words spilled out faster now, fueled by a fire that had smoldered for decades. Sarah watched him, her gaze tracing the lines of tension in his face, the way his brow furrowed as if he could will the truth into focus. "But Mayo," she said softly, "you were only 10. The mind that can twist things, fill in gaps with shadows that aren't really there." Her words were meant to soothe, but they struck a nerve instead. "I know what I saw," he snapped, the edge in his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Instantly, regret washed over him, softening his features as he stopped pacing and turned to face her. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone gentler now, almost pleading. "It's just I keep thinking there's something I missed, something I should have caught back then." Sarah let out a long, weary sigh, the sound heavy with the exhaustion of years spent watching him wrestle with this ghost. "You've been trying to piece it together forever," she said, her voice tinged with both love and frustration. "But maybe there's nothing left to uncover." She patted the empty space beside her on the bed, the gesture an invitation to rest, to let go if only for a moment. Mayo hesitated, his mind a storm of racing thoughts, too loud, too chaotic, too quiet. He saw them again, those men, their movements precise, their faces calm, almost eerily composed. It wasn't the reckless violence of desperation, it was the cold efficiency of intent. He was certain of it now more than ever, but the puzzle remained incomplete, the missing pieces taunting him from the edges of his memory. "I just need some air," he finally said, his voice low as he moved toward the door, each step heavy with unresolved tension. Sarah sank back into the pillows, pulling the blanket over her shoulders as she murmured, "Okay. Just don't stay up all night." Mayo gave a brief nod, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, before slipping out of the room. The hallway stretched before him, dark and silent, the faint creak of the floorboards under his bare feet the only sound. As he made his way to the kitchen, he flicked on the light, the sudden brightness jarring against the night's quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly, a steady drone that filled the empty space as he leaned against the counter, his gaze settling on the half-empty coffee pot from yesterday. It sat there, cold and forgotten, a small relic of routine in a life disrupted by memory. His father's face rose unbidden in his mind-hosed stern yet kind eyes, the faint lines of a smile that always seemed to carry a quiet strength. Mayo had worshipped him, trailing after him as a boy, soaking in every word, every lesson. He could still hear his father's voice, deep and steady, answering a question he'd asked one lazy afternoon. "Dad, are you ever scared?" His father had chuckled, ruffling Mayo's hair with a calloused hand. "Fear's part of the job, kiddo. But you face it. You don't run." That was the man he'd been, a good cop, unshakably honest. The kind who made enemies simply by refusing to bend. And that, Mayo knew, was the root of the unease that clawed at him now. His gut screamed that his father had crossed the wrong people, powerful, ruthless people who wouldn't stop until he was silenced. He glanced at the microwave clock. Nearly 5 a.m. Time had slipped away, swallowed by the endless loop of his thoughts. Work loomed just hours away, a tether to the present he couldn't ignore. With a heavy sigh, he trudged back to the bedroom, moving quietly so as not to wake Sarah. She lay still, her breathing soft and even, a picture of peace he envied. He grabbed his clothes from the chair and slipped into the bathroom, the hiss of the shower filling the small space with steam. The hot water cascaded over him, but it did little to ease the knots in his shoulders, the tension that had become a second skin. Still, it sharpened his focus, pulling him from the mire of the past into the resolve of the present. He'd spent his life running from that day, from the helplessness of watching his father fall. But he'd turned that pain into something else, something fierce. Becoming an FBI agent wasn't just a career. It was a vow to honor the man his father had been, to hunt the kind of predators who thought power put them above justice. Dressed now, he stood before the mirror, buttoning his shirt as he studied his reflection. The boy who'd crouched in terror all those years ago was gone, replaced by a man with hard lines etched into his face, a man driven by purpose. His hair still dripped, leaving dark spots on his collar as he ran a hand through it, then turned toward the kitchen. Sarah was awake now, standing by the counter with a steaming mug of coffee cradled in her hands. Her sleepy smile greeted him, soft and familiar. "You're up early," she said, her voice still thick with the remnants of sleep. Mayo crossed the room, brushing a kiss against her cheek as he grabbed his keys. "Yeah, work," he replied simply, though the weight of the word carried more than she could know. "Be careful," she called after him, her eyes lingering on his back with a flicker of worry she didn't voice. He nodded, stepping out into the cool dawn air, his mind already shifting to the case waiting for him. The drive to the FBI field office was a blur, the city waking slowly as the sun crept over the horizon, painting the concrete in muted orange hues. Mayo pulled into the parking lot, the engine's rumble fading as he sat for a moment, staring through the windshield. Exhaustion tugged at him, the nightmare still a faint echo in his bones, but work was his anchor. It gave him purpose when the past threatened to drown him. He stepped out, the crisp air biting at his skin as he crossed the lot and entered the building. Inside, the office hummed with the restless energy of early morning phones ringing, keyboards clacking, agents weaving through the bullpen with files in hand. It was a chaos he'd learned to navigate, a rhythm he'd made his own. He headed for the conference room, where his team was already assembled. Agent Karen Hall stood at the front, her sharp eyes scanning a thick case file as she flipped through pages with practiced precision. She glanced up as Mayo entered, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "About time, clinic. Thought you got lost out there." Her tone was dry, teasing, but there was a warmth beneath it, a camaraderie forged through late nights and hard cases. Mayo smirked, sliding into a chair at the table. "Caught in traffic," he said, the lie smooth and automatic, earning a knowing look from the room. Karen waved it off, her focus snapping back to the task at hand. "All right, let's get to it. We're zeroing in on the Carter ring. Intel says they're moving product drugs, guns, you name it, right through the precinct. And we've got reason to believe a few uniforms are on their payroll. Our play is to hit the middle ranks and climb the ladder from there." Mayo's posture stiffened, his fingers curling slightly against the table. The Carter ring had been a thorn in their side for months, a sprawling network of corruption that slipped through every crack law enforcement tried to seal. But what gripped him now, what sent a jolt through his tired nerves, was the mention of the precinct's father's precinct. Karen slid updated case files across the table, her expression grim. "We've got a primary suspect, Officer Roy Tate, mid-level, works out of the 22nd. Flagged for suspicious behavior, unexplained cash deposits, odd traffic at his place, connections to known Carter associates. Mayo's pulse quickened as he opened the file, staring at the photos of Tate. The man looked ordinary, middle-aged, gray creeping into his temples, a slight paunch straining his uniform. His face was calm, almost smug, a mask that revealed nothing. But Mayo knew better than most. The deadliest threats rarely advertised themselves. Tate's been on the force nearly 20 years, Karen continued, her voice steady but edged with urgency. Kept his head down, but our sources peg him as the linchpin running Carter's ops inside the precinct. We're bringing him in today. She tapped the file for emphasis, her gaze locking onto Mayo. Clinic, you're taking lead on the interrogation. Let's see what he's hiding. The room dispersed, but Mayo lingered, his eyes fixed on Tate's photo. The 22nd precinct, his father's world. The connection wasn't lost on him, and as he headed for the interrogation room, a cold certainty settled in his chest. This wasn't just a case, it was personal. The interrogation room was stark, its gray walls and harsh fluorescent light amplifying the silence as Mayo sat across from Tate. The two-way mirror loomed behind him, reflecting fragments of his own tense expression. Tate slouched in his chair, his demeanor relaxed, almost bored, as if this were just another inconvenience in his day. But Mayo saw the flickers beneath the surface, the slight twitch of a finger, the way his eyes darted just a fraction too quickly. This was a man who knew how to play the game, a man who'd thrived in the shadows of power. And as Mayo leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate, he knew one thing for certain. Justice wasn't just about catching the guilty, it was about dismantling the systems that let them flourish. His father's death had taught him that, and Tate, whether he realized it or not, was about to face the consequences of a world built on abuse and betrayal. The room was suffocatingly small, its bare walls pressing in like a vice, the air thick with the metallic tang of tension. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the steel table where Officer Roy Tate sat, his wrists bound by the cold bite of handcuffs. He couldn't see his own reflection in the one-way mirror behind him, but his attention wasn't on himself anyway. It was locked on the man across from him, Agent Mayo, whose steady gaze cut through the dimness like a blade. Tate slouched back in his chair, the picture of calculated nonchalance, his lips curling into a slow, deliberate grin as he sized up his interrogator. FBI, huh? He drawled, his voice low and taunting, dripping with mockery. Must be a real mess if they're dragging you fancy suits in to poke around. Mayo didn't bite. His face remained a mask of cool professionalism as he flipped open the thick manila folder. In front of him, the sound of rustling paper slicing through the silence. Officer Tate, he began, his tone clipped and precise. We're here to discuss your potential involvement in the Carter drug trafficking operation. We've got evidence tying you to known associates of the ring. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle, his fingers resting lightly on the file as if it held secrets Tate couldn't begin to fathom. Tate's grin faltered for a heartbeat, a flicker of unease rippling beneath his bravado. But he recovered fast, leaning forward just enough to test the limits of his restraints. You're fishing, Mayo, he said, his voice smooth as oil. I don't know what you're talking about. Carter, drug dealers, sounds like a bedtime story to me. His eyes glinted with defiance, daring Mayo to push harder. Unfazed, Mayo tapped the folder with a single finger, the sound sharp and deliberate. Surveillance footage doesn't lie, Tate. We've got video of known dealers walking up your driveway, lingering at your doorstep. Then there's your bank account cash deposits piling up, way beyond what a cop's salary could explain. Care to tell me how you're suddenly swimming in money? His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet intensity that hinted at the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Tate's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching under the skin, but he forced a smirk, masking the unease clawing at his chest. Maybe I've got a little hustle on the side. He shot back, his tone light, but his eyes hard. What's wrong with a guy making some extra cash? Last I checked, that's not a crime. He shifted in his seat, the handcuffs clinking faintly against the table, a reminder of the trap slowly closing around him. Mayo leaned in, closing the distance between them, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It is when that cash is soaked in blood and corruption, Officer Tate." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Tate's composure cracked. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening as the pressure bore down on him like a physical weight. "Look," he said, his voice tighter now, "I'm not tangled up with Carter. Half the names you're throwing at me, never heard of them." "Funny," Mayo replied, arching an eyebrow, his tone laced with skepticism, "because they sure seem to know you. Pretty well, too." He let the silence stretch, a suffocating void that filled the room. Pressing against Tate's defenses, the officer's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he said nothing, his mind racing behind the stony facade. Mayo watched him closely, reading every twitch, every shift, knowing silence could unravel even the toughest suspects. Then, before Tate could regroup, Mayo pressed again. "You're not getting it, Tate. We've got you pinned as the bridge between Carter's crew and the precinct. You've got two roads here. Work with us, or take the fall when this whole rotten empire comes crashing down. Your call." The smirk vanished from Tate's face, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. His gaze drifted to the mirror, lingering there as if he could see through it to the unseen watchers beyond, then snapped back to Mayo. "You're chasing shadows," he said quietly, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm not your guy." But there was a tremor in his words, a crack in the armor he'd worn so confidently moments before. "Then who is?" Mayo fired back, his tone sharp and unrelenting. "You're not some rookie stumbling into this, Tate. You've been playing this game for years." He leaned back slightly, watching as Tate's eyes flicked upward, locking onto his face, then drifting downward to the nameplate on the table. Something shifted in Tate's demeanor. His shoulders stiffened. His breath caught for a fraction of a second. "Clinic, huh?" he said slowly, his voice taking on a new, measured weight. He squinted at Mayo, his mind churning, piecing together a puzzle Mayo hadn't even known existed. "You related to..." He trailed off, his eyes narrowing as if trying to pull a memory from the shadows. "Are you Jack Clinic's kid?" The question hit Mayo like a punch to the gut. His entire body went rigid, a jolt of shock surging through him, though he fought to keep his face neutral. His father's name, Jack Clinic, hadn't crossed his mind in this context. Not here, not now. The interrogation room seemed to shrink even further, the air growing colder as memories he'd buried long ago clawed their way to the surface. "Yeah," he said after a beat, leaning back in his chair to mirror Tate's posture. Though his heart was hammering against his ribs, "He was my father." Tate's reaction was nothing like Mayo had anticipated. The officer's eyes widened, a flash of genuine surprise breaking through his guarded exterior. He blinked rapidly, as if struggling to process the revelation, then let out a low, nervous chuckle that echoed faintly in the sterile room. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, more to himself than to Mayo, shaking his head as if the weight of the past had just settled onto his shoulders. Jack Clinic's kid. Mayo's mind spun, a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. Why did Tate care? Why did the mention of his father, a man gunned down years ago, settle this hardened cop so deeply? "What does my father have to do with this?" Mayo asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He leaned forward slightly, searching Tate's face for answers. Tate didn't respond immediately. His gaze dropped to the table, his expression distant, as if he were sifting through a lifetime of secrets. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until finally he looked up, a shadow crossing his face. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, his voice tinged with something dark, regret, perhaps, or a twisted amusement. Mayo's pulse quickened, his chest tightening as he waited. Tate's lips twisted into a bitter, almost pitying smile. "Let's just say your old man stuck his nose where it didn't belong, and he paid for it." The words landed like a sledgehammer. Mayo's blood turned to ice, his breath catching in his throat as the room tilted around him. For years, he'd told himself his father's death was a senseless tragedy, a random act of violence that had torn his family apart. But Tate's tone, the way his eyes glinted with something unspoken, suggested a deeper, uglier truth. Justice, Mayo realized, wasn't just about catching the guilty, it was about facing the consequences of power twisted and abused, a lesson his father might have learned too late. Hours later, Mayo sat at his desk, the precinct humming faintly around him as night settled over the city. The glow of his computer screen bathed his face in pale light, but his eyes were unfocused, staring past the report he was supposed to be finishing. Tate's voice echoed in his skull, relentless and haunting. Your father was snooping where he shouldn't have been. And he paid the price. The words gnawed at him, reopening wounds he'd spent years stitching shut. His father's murder had always been a jagged scar on his soul, filed away as a cruel twist of fate. But now, with Tate's reaction, the shock, the sudden curiosity, it felt deliberate, personal. He closed the report with a decisive click, the sound sharp in the quiet office, and leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the desk. His father's old case files. He hadn't touched them since the funeral, when the grief had been too raw, too overwhelming. But now, with Tate's cryptic words ringing in his ears, those files beckoned like a lifeline. Jack Clinic had been a good cop, too good, maybe, to let corruption slip by unnoticed. If he'd been digging into something big, there had to be evidence, a thread Mayo could follow. Taking a deep breath, he pushed himself to his feet and made his way to the archives. The old precinct building loomed silent and still, its corridors emptier than he remembered, the air heavy with dust and time. His key card still worked, though it hadn't seen use in years, and the soft beep of the lock releasing felt like a whisper from the past. The basement was a cavern of shadows, its rows of metal shelves stretching into the gloom, packed with boxes that held decades of secrets reports, evidence logs, forgotten lives. Mayo navigated the maze with purpose, his footsteps echoing faintly, until he reached the section marked 19,901,995. His father had died in '94, a summer that still burned in his memory. It didn't take long to find the box. Jack Clinic was scrawled on the side in faded marker, the letters uneven but unmistakable. Mayo pulled it free, the weight of it grounding him as he carried it to a nearby table. Dust rose in a faint cloud as he opened it, revealing a jumble of file-traffic stops, petty drug busts, the mundane grind of a cop's life. He flipped through them, his frown deepening with each page. Nothing stood out, nothing hinted at the conspiracy Tate had implied. But then, at the bottom, buried beneath a stack of yellowed reports, his fingers brushed something different, a small notebook, its edges worn thin, its cover stained with age. His father's handwriting stared back at him from the front, for eyes only. Mayo's heart thudded in his chest as he opened it, the brittle pages crackling under his touch. The first few entries were a mess of shorthand and inutile gibberish without context bit. As he turned the pages, a picture began to emerge. Names he knew, officers still walking the precinct halls, appeared alongside question marks and cryptic notes, suspected ties to organized crime, unexplained cash deposits. His father had been onto something massive, a web of corruption stretching through the force. The deeper Mayo read, the clearer it became. A Jack Clinic had tracked drug shipments, odd shift patterns, meetings that didn't align with official records. It was all connected. Then a date stopped him cold, July 1994, the summer his father was killed. The handwriting on the final pages grew frantic, the lines slanting as if written in a rush. Someone's onto me. I think I'm being followed. Meeting Roy to confirm details. Mayo's breath hitched. Roy. Officer Roy Tate. His father had trusted Tatier, at least thought he could. Flipping back, Mayo found another note, smudged but legible. Carter might be the key. Higher up than we thought. Someone else pulling the strings. The Carter ring wasn't some petty operation, it was a machine. And his father had gotten too close. Mayo leaned back, the notebook trembling in his hands. Justice wasn't just a badge or a courtroom, it was a reckoning. A price paid for power wielded without mercy. His father had chased that truth, and it had cost him everything. Now, staring at the evidence of a betrayal decades old, Mayo felt the weight of that lesson settle into his bones. Tate wasn't just a crooked cough, was a ghost from a past Mayo could no longer ignore. Mayo slumped into the worn leather chair in his dimly lit office, the air thick with the musty scent of old paper and regret. His fingers hovered over the tattered notebook his father had left behind, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges like fragile memories. The weight of what he'd just uncovered crashed over him like a tidal wave, relentless and suffocating. His father, Jack Clinic, hadn't died in some meaningless accident. Randomness had no place in this story. No, Jack had been a hunter, stalking a beast too cunning and too ruthless to let him live. He'd been inches away from ripping open a conspiracy so vile it festered in the shadows of the city. And for that, they'd silence him. Mayo's chest tightened, his breath shallow as the realization sank deeper. Every scribbled note, every cryptic line in that journal had all pointed to the same dark truth he was now chasing. The drug ring, the crooked cops, the blood on their hands, it was all tied together. A grotesque tapestry woven with greed and betrayal. His hands shook as he snapped the notebook shut, the faint crack of its spine echoing in the stillness. He could almost feel his father's presence in the room, Jack's quiet determination, his unshakable sense of right and wrong. Mayo had inherited that fire, but now it burned hotter, fueled by grief and a hunger for justice. Earlier that day, he'd seen it in Roy Tate's eyes, to the flicker of guilt, the nervous twitch of a man who knew more than he'd ever admit out loud. Tate, a veteran officer with a cocky grin and a badge tarnished by years of dirty deals, had been part of it. Mayo replayed their encounter in his mind, Tate's forced calm as the cuffs clicked round his wrists, the way his bravado had crumbled when the swarm of agents tore through his house at dawn, uncovering stacks of cash and coded ledgers. It was Mayo who'd pieced it together, who'd dragged the evidence into the light now to bury Tate 10 times over. Now, Mayo stood in the observation room, his reflection ghostly against the two-way mirror. Beyond the glass, Tate sat alone in the stark interrogation chamber, a single bulb casting harsh shadows across his face. The man looked smaller than Mayo remembered, stripped of his uniform and swagger. His fingers drummed an erratic rhythm on the metal table. His shoulders hunched as if the weight of his sins was pressing him into the ground. The room smelled faintly of sweat and stale coffee, a fitting backdrop for a man whose life was unraveling. Mayo adjusted his tie, the silk cool against his clammy skin, and pushed through the door. It closed behind him with a heavy thud, sealing them in together, hunter and prey. Bound by the ghosts of the past, he dropped the thick case file onto the table, the sound reverberating like a judge's gavel. Papers spilled slightly from the edges, a chaotic testament to months of sleepless nights and relentless digging. Mayo took his seat across from Tate, letting the silence stretch, thick and oppressive. The only sound was the faint, incessant ticking of the clock on the wall, each second a reminder of time slipping away. "Officer Tate," Mayo began, his voice steady, but laced with an edge sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You know exactly why you're here." Tate crossed his arms, leaning back with a defiance that felt rehearsed, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "I ain't saying a word without my lawyer," he shot back, his tone dripping with false confidence. Mayo's lips twitched into a grim smile. "Sure, call your lawyer. Won't change a damn thing. We've got you cold drug money lining your pockets, backroom deals with the Carter ring, aiding one of the biggest trafficking operations the state's ever seen. You're drowning in it, Tate." For a split second, Tate's mask slipped, his eyes flickered with something raw, something scared, but he clamped his jaw shut, refusing to bite. Mayo leaned closer, tapping the file with a deliberate rhythm. "Bank records don't lie. Surveillance footage of you cozying up to their enforcers. Phone logs lighting up with calls you can't explain. And those deposits, they scream dirty louder than you ever could. So here's your shot talk. Make it easier on yourself." Tate's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his arms. "You're fishing," he growled. But the words lacked conviction. Mayo didn't flinch. He flipped open the file, spreading the evidence across the table like a dealer laying out a winning hand. Photos, transcripts, timelines, all meticulously assembled. "Fishing, this is a net, Tate, and you're caught. 10 years minimum, and that's if you're lucky. But you know what's worse. You've seen what happens to cops who betray the badge when they're locked up. They don't last long." Tate's bravado cracked, his fingers twitching against the table, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple. Mayo pressed harder, his voice softening into a dangerous calm. "Give me something, details, someone higher up. I'll talk to the DA. See about cutting you a deal. Help me, and I'll help you." Tate swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he stared at the damning papers. He was teetering on the edge, and Mayo could feel if man was a heartbeat away from breaking. But this wasn't just about the drugs. Mayo's mind flashed to his father's face, Jack's warm eyes, his steady hands, the way he'd always stood tall against the rot in the world. "Focus," Mayo whispered to himself, stealing his resolve. He leaned back, his tone shifting to something darker, more personal. "Let's start simple. Tell me about the night Jack Clinic was murdered." Tate's head jerked up, his eyes widening with a fear so visceral it seemed to choke the air from the room. For the first time, Mayo saw the man unmask, terrified, cornered. "You remember him, don't you?" Mayo's voice dropped to a frigid whisper. "My father." Tate shifted in his seat, his gaze darting to the mirror as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. Mayo leaned forward, his words slow and deliberate. "You were there, weren't you? That night by the lake, to masked men. You didn't just watch, you were part of it." Silence stretched taut between them, heavy with unspoken guilt. Then Tate snapped, his voice ragged with desperation. "I didn't pull the trigger." His eyes were wild, his chest heaving as sweat streaked down his face. "I was there, yeah, but I didn't kill him. I was just following orders." Mayo froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The admission hit him like a punch to the gut, raw and unfiltered. Rage surged through him, but he forced himself to sit back, to breathe, to keep control. "Who ordered it?" he demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. Tate's eyes darted around the room, a trapped animal sizing up a cage with no exits. "Look, I was nobody back then," he stammered. "Just a low-life cop, stuck taking orders." He was poking around, asking questions about stuff way above him, dangerous stuff. He wouldn't let it go. Mayo's fist clenched beneath the table, his nails digging into his palm. "What stuff? What was he onto?" Tate swallowed again, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "Your dad, he was too close. The Carter ring was just the surface. It went deeper, cops, lieutenants. Half the precinct on the take. He didn't know when to quit." Mayo's blood ran cold, his mind racing to connect the dots. "Who else was there that night?" he pressed, his tone hardening. "Who was the other man?" Tate's face drained of color, his cuffed hands trembling as he stared at the table. "If I tell you, I'm dead," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They'll find me." "I'll protect you," Mayo said, his words firm and unyielding. "Give me a name, and I'll get you witness protection. You won't see a cell. Help me take him down." Tate stared at the table, his breath shallow, the weight of his choice crushing him. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity, until he finally looked up. His eyes were hollow, his voice a broken rasp. "You don't get it. This guy's untouchable. Been pulling strings forever, got friends everywhere. If I talk, I'm gone." Mayo slammed a hand on the table, his patience snapping. "Who is it? Give me his name." Tate exhaled, a defeated shudder running through him. "Frank Bennett," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Mayo's world tilted. "Chief Frank Bennett," he repeated, his voice low, disbelieving. Tate nodded, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Yeah, he was there. He pulled the trigger. He's been running everything since." Mayo leaned back, his mind spinning, the pieces slamming into place with brutal clarity. Chief Bennett, man who'd risen through the ranks, who'd shaken Mayo's hand at his father's funeral, who'd built an empire on blood and leashad murdered Jack Clinic. Tate slumped in his chair, his face etched with dread. "A man who just signed his own death warrant. Now you know," he mumbled. "But if you go after him, you're starting a war you can't win." Mayo stood, towering over him, his voice icy and resolute. "Thanks for the tip. I'll take it from here." He turned and left the room, the door slamming shut behind him like a gunshot. In the cold, sterile hallway outside the holding cells, Mayo leaned against the wall, his mind a storm of fury and purpose. He'd just come from a tense meeting with the district attorney, hammering out the details of Tate's relocation into witness protection. Tate had spilled everything, them's dates, the whole rotten core of Bennett's operation. But he wasn't calm. Back in the interrogation room, he'd been a wreck, pacing, muttering, his cuffed hands trembling as he ranted about Bennett's reach. "They're gonna kill me," he'd said, his voice cracking with paranoia. "You don't get ethers everywhere. I won't make it to morning." Mayo had tried to steady him, his tone firm but hollow. "Stay calm, Follow the plan. You'll be gone soon. But Tate's fear was infectious, a reminder of the stakes they were playing with. Justice, Mayo thought, was a fragile thing easily twisted by power, easily crushed by those who wielded it without mercy. His father had died chasing it, and now Mayo carried that torch, its flame burning brighter with every revelation. Bennett's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a cancer in the system, a lesson in how unchecked power devoured the innocent. Tate, for all his cowardice, was a pawn who'd seen too much, and Mayo knew the road ahead would be brutal. But as he straightened up, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about vengeance, it was about consequences, about tearing down the corrupt and building something better from the ashes. The war was coming, and Mayo was ready to fight. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the wheels of Bennett's insidious plan began to churn, a machine of corruption already humming with sinister intent. By the time Mayo pushed through the heavy glass doors of the office that morning, his mind was a storm of determination, eager to press forward with the case that had consumed him for weeks. But the air inside was thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Faces turned toward him, each one etched with a quiet dread that made his stomach twist. Before he could even set his briefcase down, Karen Hall emerged from the cluster of desks, her steps deliberate, her usual fiery demeanor replaced by something fragile. Her skin was ashen, her lips drawn tight as if holding back a flood of words she wasn't ready to release. "Mayo," she said, her voice a hushed tremor, barely cutting through the hum of the room. "There's something you need to hear." Her eyes darted briefly to the side, scanning for eavesdroppers, a habit born from years of navigating treacherous waters. He straightened, his pulse quickening as he braced himself. "What is it?" She hesitated, her breath catching before the words slipped out, soft and brittle. "Tate's dead." The world seemed to lurch beneath Mayo's feet, his breath snagged in his throat, and for a moment, he could only stare at her, the weight of her statement pressing against his chest like a cold fist. "What?" he managed, his voice a raw scrape. "They found him in his cell this morning," she continued, her gaze dropping to the floor as if she couldn't bear to meet his eyes. "They're saying it was suicide." Mayo's blood turned to ice, a shiver racing down his spine as his mind scrambled to make sense of it. Suicide. The word clanged in his skull, sharp and discordant. Tate wild-eyed. Trembling Tate had been a mess when Mayo last saw him, sure. The man had been terrified, his voice cracking as he spilled secrets in a desperate bid to save himself. But suicidal? No. Tate had clung to life with every ragged breath, his fear a palpable thing, a tether keeping him grounded. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. He glanced around the room, the sterile fluorescence casting harsh shadows on the faces of his colleagues. Some avoided his gaze, others stared back with a mix of pity and unease. Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, they're calling it a clean suicide. The higher-ups are locking it down tight, pushing the story hard. But you and I both know what this really is." Mayo's fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms as a wave of fury surged through him. Tate hadn't taken his own life, had been silenced. Bennett's reach had slithered through the iron bars of that cell, a venomous tendril snuffing out a man who dared to speak. Mayo could feel it in his bones, a sickening certainty he'd seen play out too many times before. The chief was tidying up loose ends, sweeping away anyone who threatened his empire of corruption. Tate had been the first to fall, a sacrificial pawn in Bennett's ruthless game, and Mayo knew, with a sinking dread that coiled tight in his gut, that he was next. "You need to watch your back," Karen warned, her voice low and urgent, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't quite mask. "If Bennett's pulling strings this deep, he won't hesitate to come for you." Mayo gave a curt nod, the gravity of her words settling over him like a shroud. He was in the crosshairs now, a target painted in blood-red certainty. But backing down wasn't an option when the stench of injustice hung so heavy in the air. Bennett had to answer for this, for Tate, for every life he'd crushed under the weight of his power. Mayo's resolve hardened, a steel core forming beneath the fear. He wouldn't let this stand, even if it meant staring into the abyss. The sharp buzz of his phone jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. It vibrated insistently on his desk, a lifeline snapping him back to the present. He snatched it up, unlocking the screen with a swipe. The message glared back at him. Stark and anonymous, back off. Clinic, or your necks. No name, no number, just a naked threat pulsing in black text. His grip tightened, the plastic creaking under his fingers as his jaw locked. He'd known this was coming, had felt it lurking in the shadows since Tate's death hit him like a sucker punch. But seeing it spelled out so plainly sent a chill racing through him, a cold sweat prickling at the base of his neck. He sank into his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Across the room, Karen's eyes locked onto his, her brow furrowing as she studied him. She'd been hovering ever since the news broke, her sharp gaze tracking his every move like a hawk. She offered a small, resolute note, a silent pact that they were in this together. But even with her solidarity, Mayo couldn't shake the gnawing isolation creeping into his chest. This fight was his now, a solitary war against a monster who'd already proven he could strike from the shadows. Later that night, Mayo navigated the deserted city streets, the hum of his engine the only sound cutting through the stillness. Adrenaline still coursed through him, a relentless current keeping his senses razor-sharp. Every flicker of movement a shadow shifting in an alley. The glint of headlights in his periphery sent a jolt through his nerves. He checked his rearview mirror again, the third time in as many minutes. His eyes straining against the dark. Nothing, just empty asphalt stretching behind him. But the unease clung to him, a persistent itch he couldn't scratch, whispering that someone was out there, watching, waiting. His phone buzzed again, the sound slicing through the quiet like a blade. Another message, last chance, clinic, stop digging, or you won't make it home. His heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the engine's drone. He tightened his hands on the wheel, knuckles whitening as he scanned the road ahead. Every muscle taut. This was no idle threat. Bennett was closing in, just as Tate had warned in those final, frantic moments. Without warning, a dark van erupted from a side street, its bulk slamming into the rear of Mayo's car with a bone-rattling crunch. His head whipped back, pain exploding at the base of his skull as his car fishtailed wildly. His pulse skyrocketed, a primal surge of fear and fury flooding his veins as he wrestled the wheel, fighting to steady the vehicle. Before he could catch his breath, two motorcycles roared into view, flanking him on either side. The riders were faceless shadows beneath their helmets, but the glint of steel in their hands was unmistakable. Guns, trained on him with lethal intent. The scene ripped open an old wound, a memory he'd buried deep, the night his father had been gunned down in a hail of bullets. The roar of engines and the crack of gunfire echoing in his ears. Now, history was clawing its way back, dragging him into the same nightmare. Mayo stomped on the accelerator, his car surging forward with a guttural roar, tires screeching against the pavement. But the riders were relentless, their bikes weaving through the night like predators. Gunshots erupted, a staccato burst that shattered the driver's side window, glass raining down in a jagged cascade. Mayo swerved, the world tilting as adrenaline burned through him. He yanked the wheel hard to the left, slamming one of the motorcyclists into a parked car. The impact was brutal, a sickening crunch of metal and bone as the rider spun out, tumbling across the asphalt in a broken heap. The second rider clung to his tail, bullets spitting from his gun, a relentless barrage tearing into Mayo's car. His heart hammered, a wild drumbeat in his chest as he fumbled beneath the seat, fingers closing around the cold grip of his Glock. The road blurred past, a tunnel of light and shadow. The remaining rider pulled alongside him, his gun leveled at Mayo's head, the barrel a dark promise of death. Instinct took over. Mayo jerked the wheel right, clipping the bike. The rider wobbled, fighting for balance, but Mayo didn't hesitate. He fired twice through the shattered window, the shots ringing in his ears. The rider convulsed, his bike skidding out from under him as he crashed to the ground in a lifeless sprawl. Mayo floored it, the engine screaming as he put distance between himself and the chaos. The van was still behind him, its headlights a glaring menace in his rearview mirror. Another gunshot split the night, the rear window exploding in a shower of glass. His pulse raced, a frantic metronome as he veered into a narrow alley, the walls closing in tight around his battered car. The van screeched to a halt at the entrance, too bulky to follow. Mayo's hands trembled on the wheel, his car rattling with every dent and scrape as he sped through the claustrophobic passage. When he burst onto an open road, a fleeting wave of relief washed over him. He glanced down and saw the dark stain spreading. Across his sleeve, blood. One of the bullets had found him, a shallow graze that burned like fire. Dizziness crept in, his vision swimming as the adrenaline ebbed, leaving him raw and unsteady. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, willing himself to stay conscious. He couldn't stop, not now. Not yet. The next thing he knew, he was blinking against the stark white glare of a hospital room. His head throbbed, a dull pulse sensed to the beep of the heart monitor. His arm was swathed in bandages, the sting of the wound muted by a haze of painkillers that left him groggy. Karen Hall stood at the foot of his bed, arms crossed, her face a storm of frustration and worry. Her auburn hair was pulled back tight, but a few strands had escaped, framing the hard lines of her expression. "Heck of a night, huh?" she said, her voice low, threaded with a bitterness she didn't bother to hide. Mayo groaned, pushing himself up against the pillows, the effort sending a spike of pain through his arm. "How bad?" "You got lucky," she replied, stepping closer, her boots clicking softly against the linoleum. "Bullet grazed your arm. Could have been a lot worse. You passed out from blood loss. We almost lost you." He sank back, wincing as the night's chaos flooded back in vivid fragments. The screech of tires, the crack of gunfire, the weight of his Glock in his hand. "It was them," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "Bennett's guys. Same moves they pulled on my father. They're not just warning me anymore, they're here to end it." Karen's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with a mix of resolve and dread. "Then we've got to move fast. Bennett's not stopping until you're in the ground." He stared up at the ceiling, the sterile tiles blurring as his thoughts churned. The beeping monitor filled the silence, a steady reminder of how close he'd come to joining Tate. His arm ached, a dull throb that mirrored the deeper pain gnawing at him, the pain of justice denied, of power wielded like a blade. The attack wasn't just an attempt on his life, it was a lesson, a glaring testament to what happened when you crossed men like Bennett. But it only steeled him further. Every drop of blood, every shattered window, was a debt the chief would pay. A soft knock broke his reverie, the door creaking open to reveal a tall man in a crisp white coat. He carried a clipboard, his demeanor calm, almost polished. Glasses sat low on his nose, catching the light as he stepped inside. "Agent Clinic," the man asked, his voice smooth, practiced. "I'm Dr. Marshall. Just here to check on you." Mayo's instincts flared, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. His regular doctor had been in less than an hour ago, and no one had mentioned a follow-up this soon. Something was off, too convenient, too rehearsed. He kept his expression neutral, masking the suspicion tightening his chest. "Yeah," he said, his tone casual despite the tension coiling inside him. "Everything okay?" Dr. Marshall smiled, a thin curve of lips that didn't reach his eyes, and stepped closer to the bed. "Just need to check your vitals. Routine stuff, nothing to worry about." His hands moved with a deliberate grace, but Mayo's gaze sharpened, catching the faint twitch in the man's right hand. The subtle brush of fingers against his coat pocket. It was too smooth, too calculated. "All right," Mayo said slowly, his mind racing as he tracked every movement. The room felt smaller, the air charged with an unspoken threat. He didn't know who this man was, but one thing was clear. Bennett's reach was long, and Mayo's fight for justice had only just begun. The lesson was stark: power could twist truth, snuff out lives, and bury righteousness under a tide of fear. But Mayo wouldn't bend. Not now, not ever. Mayo shifted uneasily beneath the thin hospital blanket, every rustle of fabric a calculated effort to mask the growing suspicion churning in his gut. The sterile room smelled faintly of antiseptic, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the tiled floor. He watched the doctor, the man posing as one standing at his bedside, a figure cloaked in a white coat that seemed too pristine, too deliberate. The man's hand slipped into his pocket, and Mayo's eyes tracked the motion, his breath hitching as he braced himself for what might come. He'd expected the cool metal of a stethoscope, something routine to match the charade, but instead, the man's fingers curled around something else, something glinting, sharp, and unmistakably lethal. A syringe, His pulse roared in his ears, a frantic drumbeat drowning out the distant hum of hospital machinery. Before the imposter could act, Mayo's instincts surged to life, raw and untamed. His injured arm, throbbing with a dull ache he'd ignored for hours, shot upward in a desperate arc. Pain seared through his muscles as his fist connected, knocking the syringe from the man's grasp. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. But the fake doctor didn't falter. His other hand lashed out, swift and brutal, clamping around Mayo's throat with a force that pinned him back against the stiff mattress. The world tilted, his vision swimming as the grip tightened, squeezing the air from his lungs. He gasped, a ragged sound that scraped his throat raw, but surrender wasn't an option now. Not ever. With a surge of defiance, Mayo flailed, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the stand beside him. He gripped it, yanking it free from its base with a screech of metal against tile, and swung it with every ounce of strength he could muster. The pole crashed into the man's shoulder, a dull thud reverberating through the room. The attacker stumbled back, his hold loosening just enough for Mayo to gulp down a desperate breath. Coughing, he rolled off the bed, his head spinning from the sudden motion. Pain flared anew in his arm, a white-hot spike that nearly buckled his knees. But he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. Survival was all that mattered. The assassin recovered quickly, lunging again, this time with a knife drawn from the depths of his coat. The blade gleamed under the harsh lights, slicing through the air mere inches from Mayo's face as he twisted aside in a frantic dodge. His hands scrabbled for anything within reach, landing on the bedside tably a flimsy thing of chipped wood and plastic. He shoved it forward with all his might, toppling it into the man's path. It bought him a fleeting second, a heartbeat to think, to breathe, to plan. Their struggle erupted into chaos, a tangle of fists and flailing limbs. The assassin moved with a predator's speed, precise and relentless. But Mayo was fueled by something fiercer: adrenaline, fear, and a stubborn refusal to die. The knife came again, a silver blur aimed at his chest. He blocked it with his forearm, the impact jarring his bones as he bit back a cry. In the same motion, he drove his fist into the man's jaw. Feeling the satisfying crunch of knuckle against bone, the assassin reeled, blood seeping from his split lip, his eyes flashing with rage. Mayo seized the moment, his hands clamped onto the man's collar, yanking him downward with a force born of desperation. The knife slipped from the assassin's grasp, skittering across the floor as Mayo pinned him down, his knee grinding into the man's chest. "Who sent you?" he snarled, his voice hoarse and ragged, each word a struggle against the strain in his throat. The man glared up at him, his face twisted in a sneer. "Bennett," he spat, the name dripping with venom. "You're already dead." Fury surged through Mayo, hot and blinding. He slammed the man's head against the tile, once, twice, until the defiance in those eyes flickered out, replaced by the dull glaze of unconsciousness. Panting, he staggered to his feet, his body trembling with exhaustion and the aftershocks of adrenaline. Every muscle screamed in protest as he lurched back to the bed, slamming his fist against the call button. Minutes later, the room flooded with noise boots pounding, voices shouting. Hospital security and staff swarmed in, their faces a blur of shock and urgency as they handcuffed the limp assassin and hauled him away. Mayo sank onto the edge of the bed, his pulse still hammering, his mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. Karen Hall arrived soon after, her footsteps faltering as she crossed the threshold, her face drained of color, her wide eyes taking in the overturned table, the scattered line, the smears of blood on the floor. "Jesus, Mayo," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and dread. "They sent someone after you here, in a hospital." He met her gaze, his own voice low and rough, each word heavy with realization. "They're desperate, Hall. Bennett knows I'm close. He's trying to tie up loose ends before I can finish this." She stood there, silent for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides as she processed the gravity of his words. Then she nodded. A sharp, decisive motion. "We've got to move fast," she said, her tone hardening with resolve. Mayo dipped his head in agreement, his thoughts already spinning toward the next step. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He'd clawed his way too far to turn back now. Hours later, he stood before a house that seemed to mock him with its perfection. The lawn was manicured to a fault, the porch light spilling a warm, golden glow across the quiet suburban street. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, a facade so flawless it felt like a lie. This was Frank Bennett's home palace chief, Frank Bennett. The man Mayo was certain had orchestrated the attempt on his life, just as he'd ordered the hit on his father years ago. His heart thudded against his ribs as he raised his fist to knock, the sound reverberating through the still night. The truth waited behind that door, and he wouldn't leave without it. The door swung open, and there stood Bennett, dressed in a crisp button-up shirt and slacks, the picture of a man unwinding after a calm evening. His smile was broad, welcoming, but it never touched his iced host's cold, calculating eyes that betrayed the mask he wore. "Mayo," he said, his tone laced with feigned surprise, smooth as polished glass. "This is a late visit. What brings you here?" Mayo forced a tight smile, his jaw aching with the effort. "I need to talk," he replied, keeping his voice even. "It's important." Bennett stepped aside, gesturing him in with a casual wave. "Comin', then." "Sounds serious." Mayo crossed the threshold, every nerve on edge, his senses drinking in the details, framed photos lining the walls, snapshots of Bennett and his wife on sunlit beaches, grinning for the camera. He wondered how many of those smiles were genuine. How many people in those pictures knew the monster lurking beneath the surface? "Sit," Bennett offered, nodding toward a leather couch that gleamed under the soft living room light. Mayo remained standing, his stance rigid, his gaze locked on the man before him. "It's about the drug case," he began, his words measured, probing. "We've been digging deeper, finding connections we didn't expect." Bennett nodded, his expression placid, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a shadow of unease. "That's good news, right?" he said, his voice smooth as ever. "We need to root out all the rot in the precinct. Always have." Mayo's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying. "That's what I thought too," he shot back, "until we started finding the rot at the top." Bennett's face didn't shift, but his eyes darkened, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. He offered a smile, too tight, too forced. "You're talking about me, aren't you?" Mayo didn't flinch, didn't retreat. "Your name's been coming up, Frank. Your old ties to some of the people we've been investigating, it's making people wonder." Bennett chuckled, a low, controlled sound, leaning back in his chair with an air of unshakable confidence. "Wonder about what?" Mayo pressed forward, his voice steady but edged with steel. "I've been looking into my father's old files, his investigations, and it's interesting what I found. He wasn't just working on the usual corruption. Kasesh was digging into something deeper." Bennett's jaw tightened, a faint crack in his composure, though his tone remained even. "Your father was a good cop, one of the best, whatever he was working on back then. It was a long time ago. I don't see how it connects to anything now." The tension between them thickened, a palpable force crackling in the air. Mayo's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "I think it connects perfectly. He was close to something big. That's why he was killed." For the first time, Bennett's mask slipped. A twitch tugged at his mouth, his stance shifting ever so slightly. He waved a hand, dismissive, but the gesture lacked conviction. "You're chasing ghosts, Mayo. I told you, your father's death was a tragedy, just a robbery gone wrong." Mayo shook his head, slow and deliberate, his eyes boring into Bennett's. "No, it wasn't. It was an execution." Bennett's gaze hardened, defensive, unyielding. "I don't know what you think you're onto, but you're wrong." Mayo took a step closer, his voice icy. "Unshakable, am I? Then why did Tate die? Why was he killed after he named you?" The room fell silent, the weight of the accusation hanging between them like a storm about to break. Bennett didn't blink, didn't move, but Mayo could feel the tension radiating from him, a live wire ready to snap. Then he spoke, his words cutting through the stillness. "Did you know my father, Frank?" Bennett's face turned to stone, his eyes narrowing as the last vestiges of pretense fell away. He didn't bother with the mask anymore, he didn't even try. "Your father," Bennett said, his voice slow, deliberate, each syllable dripping with cold intent, "was a man who couldn't leave well enough alone." Mayo's breath caught in his chest, a sharp intake that sent a shiver down his spine. He'd expected deflection, denial. But the raw honesty in Bennett's tone was a blade to his heart. He stepped forward, his pulse racing, his hands curling into fists. "What do you mean?" Bennett's expression remained frigid, unrepentant. He was getting too close. "So yes, I had him taken care of." The confession landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through Mayo's soul. His father's death years of grief, questions, and buried rage crystallized into this moment, this man. Justice, Mayo realized, wasn't just a pursuit, it was a reckoning. Bennett's abuse of power had cost lives, torn families apart, and now it stared him down. Exposed and unapologetic, the lesson burned in Mayo's chest. Unchecked authority bred corruption, and its consequences rippled far beyond the grave. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about dismantling a system that thrived on betrayal. And he wouldn't stop until it was done. The air in the dimly lit room crackled with tension as Mayo stood trembling, his hands quivering not from fear, but from a fury so deep it felt like it might split him apart. His blood surged through his veins, a molten river of anger, as he stared into the cold, unflinching eyes of Chief Frank Bennett. "You murdered him," Mayo hissed, the words clawing their way out of his throat, raw and jagged. His mind spun with images of his father Jack Clink lying by the lake, teaching him how to cast a fishing line, only to be replaced by the nightmare of that same man lying lifeless, betrayed by the very system he'd trusted. Bennett didn't flinch, his gaze sharpened, a flash of something dangerous glinting in his eyes as he squared his shoulders. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice steady, almost proud, as if confessing to the crime had unshackled some hidden weight from his soul. He leaned forward slightly, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smirk. "Your father was about to rip everything apart, Mayo." He was digging too deep, asking questions no one wanted answered. "If it hadn't been me, someone else would have silenced him. I just happened to be the one holding the gun." The words hung in the air, cold and unapologetic, a twisted badge of honor Bennett wore with chilling ease. Mayo's chest tightened, his breath shallow as rage coiled tighter inside him. The confession wasn't just a revelation, it was a taunt, a slap across the face of everything he'd held sacred. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the worn wooden floor, his voice dropping to a strained whisper laced with venom. "And now you're trying to bury me too, aren't you?" His eyes locked onto Bennett's, searching for a flicker of remorse, but all he found was that same cruel glint, a predator sizing up its prey. Bennett's smirk widened, a grotesque curve that made Mayo's stomach churn. "You should have stayed out of it, kid," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You've waded into waters too dark and deep for you to swim. You've got no idea what's waiting for you down there." The chief's posture radiated arrogance, his chest puffed out as if he were untouchable, a king presiding over a kingdom built on blood and lies. That was a final spark Mayo couldn't smother. With a roar that erupted from the depths of his soul, he lunged forward, his hands seizing Bennett's collar in a vice grip. The fabric bunched under his fingers as he shoved the older man backward, slamming him against the wall with a force that rattled the framed pictures hanging nearby. A dull thud echoed through the room as Bennett's head snapped back, his breath escaping in a sharp gasp. For a fleeting moment, surprise flickered across his face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. With a snarl, Bennett shoved back, his hands clawing at Mayo's arms, his strength surprising for a man who'd spent years hiding behind a desk. The two stumbled apart, the space between them igniting with chaos. The room became a battlefield. Bennett swung first, his fist cutting through the air and crashing into Mayo's ribs. Pain exploded in Mayo's side, stealing the air from his lungs, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. He retaliated with a wild punch of his own, his knuckles connecting with Bennett's jaw in a sickening crunch that sent the chief staggering back, clutching his face. Blood trickled from the corner of Bennett's mouth, but his eyes blazed with fury. "You're done, Bennett," Mayo shouted, his voice a thunderclap as he charged again, fueled by years of grief and betrayal. Bennett growled, his features twisting into a mask of rage and desperation. He threw another punch, a reckless swing that Mayo ducked under with agility born of adrenaline. In one fluid motion, Mayo grabbed Bennett's arm, twisting it behind his back with a brutal yank. The chief snarled in agony, his body thrashing as he tried to break free, but Mayo's grip was iron. "You think you can take me down?" Bennett spat, his voice hoarse with defiance. With a sudden jerk, he drove his elbow into Mayo's already bruised ribs, sending a jolt of pain searing through him. Mayo grunted, his vision blurring for a heartbeat, but he refused to let go. With a surge of strength, he shoved Bennett forward, sending him sprawling into a small wooden table. The table wobbled and tipped, a delicate vase atop it shattering into a cascade of porcelain shards that glittered like fallen stars on the floor. Breathing heavily, Bennett scrambled to his feet, his suit jacket torn at the shoulder, his hair disheveled. His ice wild and unhinged darted to the counter nearby, where a glint of steel caught the dim light. He lunged for it, fingers closing around the handle of a kitchen knife. With a guttural yell, he swung at Mayo, the blade slicing through the air with desperate intent. But Mayo was faster. He sidestepped the attack, his heart pounding in his ears, and with a swift kick, he swept Bennett's legs out from under him. The chief crashed to the floor, the knife skittering across the hardwood, out of reach. Before Bennett could recover, Mayo was on him, pinning him down with the full weight of his body. His knees pressed into Bennett's chest, his hands locking the chief's wrists to the ground. Sweat dripped from Mayo's brow, mingling with the dust and tension in the air. "It's over," he said, his voice low and unshakable, a promise carved in stone. Beneath him, Bennett writhed, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "You don't know what you've started, kid," he hissed, his words venomous but weak. The last gasp of a man who'd lost everything. Mayo didn't dignify it with a response. His hand slipped into his pocket, pulling out a pair of handcuffs that gleamed coldly in the flickering light. "Chief Frank Bennett," he said, his tone deliberate, each word a hammer striking the final nail. "You're under arrest for drug trafficking, corruption, and the murder of Jack Clink." Bennett's face contorted with rage as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, binding his hands behind his back. "You'll regret this, Clink," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You've got no idea what's coming for you." Mayo rose, hauling Bennett to his feet with a grip that brooked no resistance. He ignored the threats, his focus singular and unyielding. "I'll see you in court," he said, his voice as cold as the night air that greeted them as he dragged Bennett out of the house. The stars above glittered indifferently, but for Mayo, the weight of the moment settled over him like a mantle. He'd done it. His father's killer was in chains, a small but vital step toward justice. Yet as he shoved Bennett into the back of his car, the chief's parting words echoed in his mind, a dark whisper of consequences yet to unfold. Weeks later, the courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, a hive of whispers and rustling papers that hummed beneath the fluorescent lights. Mayo sat near the front, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair until his knuckles whitened. Every nerve in his body thrummed with anticipation and dread. As the trial of Chief Frank Bennett began, the journey to this moment had been a marathon of sleepless nights and relentless preparation, each day stretching into an eternity. Now, the truth would be laid bare before a packed room of onlookers, jurors, and a judge whose stern gaze promised impartiality. Across the aisle, Bennett sat with an air of unsettling calm. His tailored suit clung to him awkwardly, a polished facade that couldn't mask the rot beneath. His eyes roamed the room, detached and defiant, as if the proceedings were a mere inconvenience. His defense team, led by the slick Marcus Hartley, exuded confidence, their sharp suits and sharper tongues ready to weave a tapestry of lies. Mayo's stomach twisted at the sight, but he steeled himself. He'd spent years, perhaps his whole life, building toward this reckoning, even if he hadn't known it until recently. The trial opened with Hartley taking the floor, his voice smooth as silk as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone warm yet commanding, "my client, Frank Bennett, is not the villain you've been led to believe. He's a man ensnared in a web of corruption, not by his own design, but by forces far greater than himself. Powerful, shadowy figures pulled the strings, and Frank, he was just a pawn, a man caught in a storm he couldn't escape." Hartley paced before the jury, his hands gesturing with practiced ease. "He acted to survive, to protect his life and those he cared about. He's no mastermind as a victim, drowning in a sea of someone else's making." Mayo's fists clenched tighter. his nails digging into his palms as Hartley's words slithered through the room. The attorney painted Bennett as a tragic figure, a reluctant participant in a game he hadn't chosen. It was a lie so bold it bordered on genius, and the worst part was the jury's attentive silence. They were listening, their faces a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Hartley was good to good, and Mayo felt a flicker of doubt gnaw at him. Could they really buy this? But then the prosecution took the stage, and Rachel Monroe's presence shifted the air. She was a force sharp, relentless, her every word a blade cutting through Hartley's fiction. She laid out the case with surgical precision, a sprawling network of corruption, rooted in the police force, with Bennett at its heart. Financial records, surveillance footage, and Bennett's own damning confession to Mayo were stacked like bricks in an unassailable wall. The evidence was ironclad, a testament to the years Mayo and his team had poured into exposing the truth. When Mayo took the stand, the weight of every eye in the room pressed down on him. His heart pounded, but he straightened his spine, forcing himself to focus on the facts. Monroe approached, her voice steady. "Mayo Clink, can you tell us about the night your father was murdered?" The question sliced through him, and his throat constricted. He swallowed hard, grounding himself with a deep breath. "I was 10, he said, his voice low but firm. "We were at the lake, me father and me. Two masked men ambushed him. He yelled at me to run, so I hid. I watched from the bushes as they killed him." The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with the gravity of his words. Mayo's mind flickered back to that night, rustle of leaves, the glint of moonlight on water, the muffled cries of his father as life slipped away. He blinked, pushing the memory down. Monroe nodded, her expression urging him on. "Did you know who those men were at the time?" she asked. Mayo shook his head. "No, not until recently. One of them was Frank Bennett." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Monroe silenced it with a raised hand. "And how did you discover Chief Bennett's involvement?" she pressed. Mayo's gaze shifted to the jury, his voice gaining strength. "I've been investigating a drug trafficking ring tied to the police." Every lead pointed back to Bennett. "When I confronted him, he admitted it. He said my father was too close to exposing their operation, that's why he had to die." The defense leapt up, Hartley's voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor, that's hearsay." But the judge's gavel came down, overruling him with a curt, "Sustained." "Continue." Monroe pressed forward, her eyes locking with Mayo's. "So you're saying Chief Bennett confessed to your father's murder?" Mayo nodded, his stare unwavering as he faced the jury. "Yes, my father was going to blow it all wide open. That's why Bennett killed him." The words landed like a thunderbolt, and Mayo felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about his father anymore, it was about justice, about the cost of unchecked power. Bennett had wielded his authority like a weapon, cutting down anyone who threatened his empire. But now, pinned beneath the weight of truth, he was powerless. As Mayo stepped down from the stand, his eyes met Bennett's for a fleeting moment. The chief's calm facade cracked, revealing a flicker of fear. The lesson was clear: power could corrupt, but its abuse would always demand a reckoning. The courtroom buzzed with a tense, electric energy as Agent Mayo Clinic sat motionless, letting the echoes of his testimony settle into the minds of the jury. He could feel their eyes on him, 12 strangers tasked with unraveling the tangled web of truth and lies he'd spent years piecing together. His hands rested on his lap, steady despite the storm raging inside him. He'd just recounted every excruciating detail: the night his father was gunned down, the whispered confession from Chief Frank Bennett, the cold realization that the man he'd once respected had orchestrated it all. The prosecutor gave him a nod, grateful, respectful, stepping back. "Thank you, Agent Clinic. No further questions." Mayo exhaled, a faint tremor of relief loosening the knot in his chest. But the respite was fleeting. The defense attorney, Hartley, rose like a predator scenting weakness. He was a weary man with sharp features and sharper eyes, his dark suit cutting a stark silhouette against the muted tones of the courtroom. He didn't waste a moment, striding across the polished wooden floor with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Agent Clinic," he began, his voice smooth and probing as he paced, shoes clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. "You've been through quite a lot, haven't you? Significant trauma, I'd imagine." Mayo's gaze hardened, his hazel eyes narrowing as he met Harley's stare. The word trauma grated against him, too clinical, too hollow to capture the raw, gaping wound left by his father's death. "I lost my father," he said, his voice low but firm, each syllable deliberate. "I wouldn't call it trauma, I'd call it murder." Harley smirked, a fleeting twitch of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. He tilted his head, as if Mayo's defiance amused him. Of course, murder, a terrible thing. But loss like that, it does things to a person, doesn't it? It clouds the mind, twists memories into something unreliable. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air like smoke. "Maybe, in your grief, you've spun this story in your head. Convinced yourself Chief Bennett is the villain you need him to be." Mayo's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to lunge across the stand and shake Harley until that smug grin fell away. But he held himself still, anchored by the truth he'd clawed his way to uncover. "The facts don't lie," he said, his tone cutting through the room like a blade. Harley didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though loud enough for the jury to hear every word. "But people do, Agent Clinic. You claim Chief Bennett confessed to you face-to-face, no less. A dramatic moment, I'm sure. Yet you have no recording, no proof beyond your word. Isn't that convenient?" Mayo's fists clenched beneath the table, hidden from view. But he kept his face composed. "No," he admitted, the word clipped and steady. "I don't have a recording." He straightened, his shoulders squaring as he stared Harley down. "But I know what I heard." Harley spun on his heel, dismissing Mayo with a theatrical wave of his hand as he returned to his seat. "No further questions," he snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. "We all see what's happening here." Mayo's lips parted, a retort burning on his tongue. But he swallowed it. The truth was his shield, and he wouldn't let Harley's taunts pierce it. The trial stretched on for days, each one heavier than the last. The courtroom became a battlefield, its high ceilings and oak-paneled walls bearing witness to a relentless clash of testimonies. Witnesses shuffled to the stand, nervous beat cops with darting eyes, a weathered informant wringing his hands, a grieving widow whose voice trembled with quiet fury as she spoke of her husband, another casualty of Bennett's greed. Harley fought like a man possessed, twisting words, sowing doubt, but the evidence was a tidal wave he couldn't hold back. Stolen ledgers detailing drug shipments, bank records tracing dirty money, a grainy security tape showing Bennett's unmistakable silhouette at a warehouse drop-off it. All painted a portrait too vivid to deny. Frank Bennett, once the untouchable chief of police, had built a drug empire on the bones of those he'd sworn to protect. And when Jack Clinic, Mayo's father, had gotten too close to exposing it, Bennett had silenced him with a bullet. Mayo sat through it all, his face a mask of resolve, though inside he was a tangle of grief and rage. Every night, he'd return to his sparse apartment, the silence pressing against him as he replayed the day's events. Sleep eluded him. Instead, he saw his father's face, those steady gray eyes, that reassuring smile fading into the chaos of that fateful night. The crack of gunfire echoed in his skull, the memory of his father crumpling to the ground, a wound that never stopped bleeding. Yet each morning, he returned to the courthouse, driven by a promise he'd made years ago, to see justice done. When the final arguments concluded, the jury vanished behind closed doors. Hours crawled by, each tick of the clock a hammer against Mayo's nerves. He sat in the hallway, elbows on his knees, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. His wife, Sarah, lingered nearby, her presence a quiet anchor. She didn't push him to talk, didn't fill the silence with empty reassurances. She simply waited, her dark hair catching the dim light, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder when the weight became too much. The weight was torture, a purgatory of doubt and hope warring within him. Had he done enough? Would they see the truth? At last, the jury returned. The courtroom fell into a hush so profound Mayo could hear his own heartbeat. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a stern face softened by exhaustion, rose to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Frank Bennett, guilty of all charges." The words crashed over Mayo like a wave, lifting a burden he'd carried for years. He closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping him as relief flooded his veins. Guilty. drug trafficking, corruption, first-degree murder. The litany of Bennett's sins laid bare, his empire of lies reduced to ash. It wasn't victory in it yet, but it was justice, hard-won and bittersweet. The judge, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a voice like tempered steel, turned to Bennett. He stood in the defendant's box, his once imposing frame diminished, his tailored suit wrinkled from days of wear. "Chief Frank Bennett," she began, her gaze unwavering, "you have been found guilty of heinous crimes, drug trafficking, corruption, and the murder of an innocent man. You wore a badge meant to symbolize protection, yet you turned it into a tool of betrayal." Mayo watched Bennett closely, searching for a crack in the man's stoic facade. The chief's broad shoulders slumped slightly, his piercing blue eyes dulled, but his jaw remained set, a vestige of the arrogance that had fueled his reign. "You abused your authority," the judge continued, her words deliberate, "flooding this community with poison, and when Jack Clinic threatened to expose you, you took his life to safeguard your empire. Your actions have shattered families, eroded trust, and left scars that may never heal." The courtroom held its breath as she delivered the sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. A gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a murmur of shock and approval. Bennett's mask slipped for a fraction of a second as lips twitched. His eyes flickered with something like fear before hardening again. The bailiff approached, cuffs gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and snapped them onto Bennett's wrists. The metallic clink echoed, a sound of finality. As he was led past Mayo, Bennett's head turned, his voice a low growl. "This isn't over." Mayo didn't flinch, didn't reply. He met Bennett's glare with a steady calm, knowing the man's threat wasn't empty. The trial had peeled back layers of corruption, exposing a network that stretched beyond Bennett, faceless figures with deeper pockets and darker ambitions. But for now, this chapter was closed. The judge's voice rang out one last time as Bennett reached the door. "Let the sentence stand as a warning. No one, no matter their power or position, is beyond the reach of justice." The words settled into Mayo's bones, a reminder of the lesson carved into this ordeal. Power, unchecked, devoured everything: interest, lives, hope. Bennett's fall was proof that even the mightiest could crumble when their crimes caught up to them. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Mayo stepped into the cool evening air, the weight of the day still clinging to him. He drove to the cemetery, the hum of the engine a steady companion to his swirling thoughts. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked through the wrought iron gates, the breeze tugging at his jacket. Rows of headstones stretched out before him, silent sentinels bathed in the fading light. He stopped at his father's grave, the name Jack Clinic etched into the granite, weathered but enduring. Kneeling, he traced the letters with his fingertips, the stone cold against his skin. "It's over." "Dad," he whispered, the words trembling in the stillness. "I got him." The weeks since the verdict had been a blur, yet Bennett's face lingered in his mind, the smug tilt of his chin, the cold certainty in his eyes, even as the gavel fell. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, Mayo felt the first stirrings of peace. He sat back, the grass damp beneath him, and let the memories flood in. The night of the murder replayed in vivid detail, his father's urgent shout to run, the deafening blast of the gun, the sight of Jack collapsing in a pool of blood. The years that followed had been a crucible: sleepless nights poring over files, dead-end leads, the gnawing betrayal of discovering Bennett's role. That pain had forged him, sharpened him into the man who'd faced down Harley's barbs and brought Bennett to his knees. "I didn't know how this would end," he murmured to the stone, his voice catching. "But I kept my promise. He didn't get away with it." The wind carried his words away, rustling the leaves overhead. Closure wasn't a neat bow on his grief, it was a jagged, imperfect thing, but it was his. Bennett was locked away, his power stripped, his legacy a cautionary tale. Yet Mayo knew the fight wasn't finished. The drug ring's roots ran deep, nourished by corruption higher up the chain. He'd seen glimpses of it in coded messages, hushed conversations, the nervous glances of officers who'd escaped the net. The battle loomed ahead, daunting and vast. But he'd face it, for his father, for himself. He stood, brushing the dirt from his knees, and turned to Sarah. She waited a few paces away. her silhouette framed by the golden light spilling through the trees. Her presence had been his lifeline through the nights he'd woken screaming, the days he'd come home bruised and bloodied, the moments he'd doubted he could go on. She stepped forward, her hand slipping into his, warm and steady. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. Her quiet strength said it all. "I'm proud of you," she said at last, her voice soft but resolute, cutting through the stillness like a beacon. He squeezed her hand, a faint smile tugging at his lips as they stood together, the world fading into a gentle hush around them. Justice had prevailed, but its lesson soft accountability of the ruin wrought by misused power would guide him forward into the shadows yet to be faced. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the sky unfurled a breathtaking tapestry of orange and purple, streaks of color bleeding into one another like a painter's final, deliberate strokes. The light didn't vanish with a mournful sigh. Instead, it ebbed away gently, carrying a quiet promise, a chapter closing. Yes, but with the whisper of a new one trembling on the edge of existence. Mayo stood there, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm he hadn't noticed in years, as if the air itself had grown kinder. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost swallowed by the breeze. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a release, a thread of heaviness unraveling from his soul. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he sensed a lightness creeping in, fragile but real, like a bird testing its wings after a long confinement. Beside him, Leela turned her head slightly, her eyes catching the last glints of daylight. "Let's go home," she said, her words steady but warm, laced with an unspoken understanding that tethered them together. Without another word, they pivoted in unison, their footsteps falling into a natural cadence as they moved away from the overlook. Their shadows stretched behind them, long and lean, like silent sentinels marking the path they'd traveled. The gravel crunched under their shoes, a faint percussion to the evening's stillness, and ahead, the silhouette of the car waited patiently, its faded blue paint glowing faintly in the twilight. Mayo's mind churned as they walked, each step peeling back another layer of the burden he'd carried for so long. The past clung to him like damp earth, sticky, unrelenting, but now, with every stride, he felt it loosen, just a fraction. It wasn't gone, not entirely. The road ahead promised more struggles, more battles that would test his resolve. But in this fleeting moment, peace settled over him like a thin, comforting blanket. He stole a glance at Leela, her profile sharp against the softening sky, and wondered what she saw when she looked at him. Did she see the man he'd been, broken and bowed by his own choices, or the one he was trying to become? Leela, for her part, kept her gaze forward, though her thoughts were anything but still. She'd watched Mayo wrestle with his demons for years, his every move shadowed by guilt and regret. Tonight, though, there was something different, a flicker of relief in his eyes, a subtle shift in the way he held himself. She felt it too, a quiet triumph blooming in her chest, not because the war was won, but because he'd taken a step toward reclaiming himself. Her fingers brushed against his as they walked, an accidental touch that sent a jolt through her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let the contact linger, a silent vow that she'd stand by him, no matter how rough the path ahead became. Behind them, the world seemed to hold its breath. The trees lining the overlook swayed gently, their leaves rustling in a chorus that felt almost reverent. A lone hawk circled overhead, its wings slicing through the air with effortless grace, a witness to their departure. The air carried the faint scent of pine and earth, grounding them in the moment, while the distant hum of crickets began to rise, a soft lullaby for the night that was creeping in. As they neared the car, Mayo paused, his hand resting on the door handle. He turned back for a moment, taking in the expanse of the horizon one last time. The colors had deepened now, purples giving way to inky blues, and he felt a pang of sorrow, but of clarity. Justice, he thought, wasn't always loud or swift. Sometimes it was this, a slow unwinding, a reckoning with oneself. He'd abused his power once, let it twist him into someone he didn't recognize, and the consequences had nearly crushed him. But standing here, with Leela beside him, he understood that the truest punishment wasn't vengeance from others. It was living with the weight of what he'd done, and the truest redemption was choosing to carry it differently. Leela noticed his hesitation and stepped closer, her presence a quiet anchor. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low but firm, cutting through the haze of his thoughts. He nodded, a small, genuine smile tugging at his lips first she'd seen in months. "Yeah," he said, and he meant it. They climbed into the car, the creak of the seats and the jingle of keys filling the silence. As Leela turned the ignition, the engine sputtered to life, and the headlights carved a path through the gathering dusk. The drive home stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt winding through the hills. But it didn't feel daunting, not tonight. Mayo leaned his head against the window, the cool glass soothing against his skin, and let his eyes drift shut. The battles would come again, he knew that. Power, when misused, left scars that didn't fade easily, and he'd spend a lifetime atoning for his. But for now, he had this, the hum of the engine, the warmth of Leela beside him, and the fragile, precious stillness of a moment where justice felt less like a gavel, and more like a chance to begin again.